Hello and welcome back. My name is David Gray. I'm one of the therapists at Casa Palmera. Welcome back to our family program. And for today's group, the topic is substance use disorder. Now, a little bit of backstory on this particular topic. Normally in family program, we show a film called Pleasure Unwoven. Pleasure Unwoven is a film narrated by Dr. Kevin McCulley. I would really like to encourage you to get access to that film and be able to watch it, especially in conjunction with what I'm going to be presenting here on this particular topic. It's available on Amazon, $30 to $35, somewhere in that neighborhood, and it's a very, to me, it's the best educational film on understanding what addiction is and what addiction does that I've ever seen. And I've been doing this now for a little over 25 years, seen a lot of different types of things trying to explain what addiction is. This by far does the best job of anything I've seen. So we're going over this now without you having had the ability to have seen the film first. And I'm going to do my best to kind of explain some of the concepts that are in that film. Among them, the film talks quite a bit about, this is the brain, so it's my version of the poorly drawn brain. So this is going to be the neurochemistry, and this is kind of like looking at the brain sideways. So the ear would be right about here, and this would be somebody looking forward that way. And the film talks a lot about executive functioning, and it talks about the midbrain. Now, these are two areas really strongly implicated in addiction. And the film talks, it starts off with Dr. McCulley saying, of all the things to understand about addiction, or all the questions to ask, the most important one is addiction a disease? One of the reasons this is so important is illustrated by understanding how diabetes was responded to in this country for many, many years. And to do that, follow through this example. So here's the disease model. The disease model basically says we have an organ that develops a defect, and as a result of the defect in that organ, we then see observable symptoms. Now again, this might seem master of the obvious, and by today's standards, granted it is, but there was a time when medical science did not have this information. So let's take a look again at diabetes. We know that the organ is the pancreas. The defect is either no or very limited insulin production. And as a result of that defect in that organ, we then see a variety of symptoms. Now, the importance of this can be seen with the following question. Before doctors understood the disease model, what were they treating? And if you guessed the symptoms, you're right. And that's kind of like whack-a-mole. Even if doctors got one under control, another one's going to pop up. Why? Because we still have dysregulated blood sugar in the body because the pancreas isn't producing insulin. Once doctors understood this and they were able to replace the insulin, the symptoms resolved or became manageable, and we now had diabetics living well into old age, passing away from things often having nothing to do with complications of diabetes. Prior to the disease model, diabetics often died in childhood. That was the significant impact that the disease model had on our understanding of diabetes. So how about addiction? To understand addiction as a disease then helps us to understand what's going on within the neurochemistry. Is this just about choice and a lack of willpower, or is there something truly going on in the physiology? For addiction to qualify as a disease, it needs to meet this model. And this is really what Pleasure Unwoven gets into. And I'm going to explain this just in very simplistic terms. Again, I'd really encourage you to watch the film. Dr. McCulley does it in much greater depth and detail as a medical doctor. And the film gets quite a bit into the neuroscience and neurochemistry of addiction. So more kind of like the layman's understanding of it. These two areas of the brain do things specifically very different. Executive functioning really is what kind of runs and governs our ability to have choice, right? The midbrain, on the other hand, I like the way Kevin states, it gets us through the next 15 seconds alive. And it does this by making things necessary for survival pleasurable. So things such as eat, sex, in this case for reproduction, or maybe the organism needs to kill for survival. All of those are driven by the way the midbrain communicates with executive functioning and the way executive functioning communicates back down. And what research has discovered is there is a defect that develops in the neurochemistry. It's not in the choice area of the brain, which many people obviously thought it would be, because addicts are people with broken choice makers, right? Their choices are so irrational and crazy it defies common sense, reason, logic, and intelligence. And it does, I'll grant you that. But what's happening and why that's happening is because of a defect down here at a much deeper level in the neurochemistry in the midbrain. So, and this is kind of a way that you could understand it. Let's say a non-alcoholic is drinking. That drug, alcohol, would be processed in the neurochemistry, maybe in a pattern kind of like so. In the brain of somebody with an addictive disorder, myself included, I'm an alcoholic in recovery, that drug reacts much differently in my neurochemistry than it does in the brain of a non-alcoholic. Why? Because I have an addictive disordered neurochemistry. The non-alcoholic does not. So that drug in my brain is going to be processed much differently than the drug will be in the brain of the non-alcoholic. And another thing that's really fascinating with addiction is the midbrain gets tricked into thinking the number one thing necessary for survival is the drug. And what happens is the midbrain becomes more powerful at driving behavior than executive functioning is to prevent it. In other words, normally we have top-down control where executive functioning will control the impulses of the midbrain. This is what's necessary to prevent me from, when I walk into a restaurant, from ripping the steak off of somebody's plate and starting to eat it right in front of them. I need to have impulse control, or else I would be arrested. I would not be able to engage in society. I would not be experiencing or exhibiting socially acceptable behavior, right? That's made possible by the way executive functioning, again, controls the impulses of the midbrain. In addiction, this breaks, and the midbrain becomes much more powerful at controlling behavior than executive functioning's ability to control that behavior. And so we have bottom-up processing, and a process known as hypofrontality kicks into play with addiction. Hypofrontality is nothing short of devastating. Think about with a diabetic. We have a term called hypoglycemic. That means low blood sugar. Hypofrontality is not a good thing. That means low executive functioning in the choice mechanism of the addict. So that what ends up happening here is the midbrain tricked into believing I've got to get that drug or I will die. Choices and decisions are being made that are just irrational, unreasonable, illogical, and again, granted they are. And why that's happening is because of a defect we now have in the midbrain in the neurochemistry. So that we've met the burden of proof. Addiction qualifies as a disease because the organ is identified, it's the midbrain. The defect, and I'm just going to call it, it has a broken drug processor, right? And then we see all those symptoms now of addiction as a result of the broken drug processor in the midbrain. Now, exactly what those symptoms are, I'm going to be covering next as we're discussing this topic, so you understand how we actually diagnose this. In other words, if somebody says, how do I know if I'm an addict? How do I know if I'm an alcoholic? It's based on very simple criteria, actually, that's just in black and white. And we're going to go over this list together, and these are just kind of basically yes or no responses. Does this apply or does it not, right? And I'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to kind of go over this briefly first, just to help you understand the reason we see these symptoms in addiction is because it's a manifestation of the defect in this organ, the midbrain, that it now has a broken drug processor. And anytime drugs are put into that midbrain, it will always have a broken drug processor. Any drugs of abuse, any of the drugs that we take to get high on. And I like the way I heard somebody put it one time. It's called alcoholism, not alcoholism. It's something that is in our neurochemistry. It does not go away. In fact, here's another way to explain that might also help it to be understandable. And I'll use green for this one, and you'll see why here in just a second. So it's illustrated when we see how this turns into this. And when you guys are here in person, I'm asking you what that is, right? So I'll give you just a second. Any guess? For those of you who identified this as a pickle, you're correct. And this is a cucumber. Now, kind of a little funny story. It's a little embarrassing to admit. I was in my mid-30s and I did not realize that pickles came from cucumbers. First time somebody told me this, I kind of looked at them and I said, you must really think I'm stupid. Pickles don't come from cucumbers. My mom cut up cucumbers, put them in the salad. Pickles grow on pickle vines. Everybody knows that. And that was my story, and I didn't realize that actually pickles do come from cucumbers. Now, here's the interesting analogy on why we use this for addiction. The best of modern science and technology in the world cannot take that pickle and turn it back into a cucumber, all right? The best of modern science and technology in the world cannot take this pancreas that doesn't produce insulin and turn it again into an insulin-producing pancreas, nor can the best of modern science and technology in the world take this addictive disordered neurochemistry and turn it back into a non-addictive disordered neurochemistry. Once that switch flips, it stays on, and the way that we now manage this disease is really very simple. The way we get all these symptoms to resolve and to go away, down to zero, stop putting the drug into the neurochemistry. And while that is simple, it is something that people have really struggled with the understanding of and the acceptance of and the surrendering to the truth of. But just like today we know how to successfully and effectively manage diabetes, we also know how to successfully and effectively manage addictive disorder or addiction, alcoholism. And that is through an abstinence-based model. And I also just kind of want to bust one myth here maybe, and just kind of put it up here, addict versus alcoholic, right? And you'll often hear people say things like, well, I'm an alcoholic, I never use drugs, or I'm an addict. I've never had a problem with alcohol. I can still drink. What's the problem with that? For all intents and purposes, there's virtually no difference between these two conditions. It's two different words to describe the same exact condition. It's like a person saying, I'm not diabetic, I'm just insulin deficient. We'd say, well, but that's really the same thing. We know that is diabetes, and your pancreas doesn't produce insulin, so it's the same thing regardless of the word or the label that you use to place on it. An alcoholic is somebody whose primary drug of choice was alcohol. And I say that very specifically for a reason. Alcohol is one of the most deadly, toxic, destructive, poisonous drugs on the planet. We don't want to hold it harmless because it's viewed as socially acceptable and it's legal. And as though drugs that are illegal and that aren't socially acceptable are the dangerous drugs that are highly problematic. Problems related to alcohol use is one of the leading causes of death in this country still to this day. So regardless of the drug of choice somebody's using, I think it's helpful just to understand it as a problem with addiction, it's substance use disorder, and we now must abstain from the use of all of those drugs that we take to get high on in order to be successful with recovery. Here maybe is kind of another way of putting it without getting too deep in the weeds on this topic for this particular presentation. Look at these maybe as different drugs. Drug A, drug B, drug C, drug D, drug E. All right, say that one fast 3 times. So maybe this is alcohol, maybe this is opiates, maybe this is benzos, this is marijuana, and this is, amphetamines, methamphetamines, right? Here's what addiction does not mean. Well, I need to stay away from these drugs, but I can use these without a problem. We don't see that that works, and we do not see people having success with it. And then people say, well, what about marijuana? That's not physically addictive. Well, today's marijuana is physically addictive, and it's a very powerful, strong, intoxicating drug. And in the last several years, it's become exponentially more powerful than it ever was. And also, it's important to understand, we don't want to put too much emphasis maybe on just the physical side of addiction, because there's the psychological side of addiction. And the psychological side of addiction, in my opinion, is the far greater thing to overcome for people in recovery than the physical. Once you're through withdrawals, the physical side is over, but now we got this psychological side of addiction left over. And I'm not going to write this up on the board at this point, but here's what addiction is, and here's what addiction does. We've developed very low frustration tolerance. In addition to that, we now have very poor impulse control. On top of that, combine it with instant gratification. we've become habituated to instant gratification. So you take away the use of alcohol and other drugs, that stuff hasn't gone away. I still have low frustration tolerance, poor impulse control, and I'm still habituated to instant gratification. It's one of the reasons why we see relapse rates so high, because people aren't doing what's necessary to learn how to cope with and deal with feelings and with the things that's going on in life. In fact, I've heard it accurately said, it's not so much that we have a drug problem as we have a living problem. And when you stop the use of alcohol and other drugs, now the living problem is here and we have to deal with that. In another group that I'll be doing for you in our family program on continuing care and support systems, we talk about what all those various things are that we need to be engaged in using, called support systems, in order to successfully be able to stay clean and sober and engage in effective disease management. It's kind of another way to look at this, that with diabetes, we'd want to engage in effective disease management. With addiction, we want to engage in effective disease management. In fact, here's another way to look at it. I think it's fair to say that some people that have diabetes, for whatever reason, they really refuse to accept and understand their diabetes, and then they don't treat it appropriately and responsibly. We know that happens. You may even know somebody yourself where you've experienced that in your own life. And the results are often tragic when that occurs, all the way up to and including death can result. With addiction, again, for whatever reason, we know people don't work on understanding and accepting that condition and then treating it effectively and appropriately. And just because we refer to addiction as a disease, that does not absolve somebody of personal responsibility to treat it effectively, any more than it would with diabetes. So what, I say, well, I'm a diabetic. What do you expect me to do? Treat the disease responsibly? It's a disease after all. It's like, yeah, it's a disease, and I do expect you to treat it appropriately and responsibly. Once we do that, we're then free of the symptoms of it. So now let's talk about how do we diagnose addiction? And again, somebody asks, how do I know if I'm an alcoholic? How do I know if I'm an addict? Well, this isn't just based on feelings, it's based on very tangible black and white questions that we ask and we go over. Now, you're going to be able to see this on your screen as I'm going over it with you. Because I don't have it all memorized, I'm going to hold the handout and I'm going to read item number 1, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. I'm going to do the same with item number 2, etc. Also on that handout, I have the information for Pleasure Unwoven and Dr. Kevin McCulley's name on there, so that you can look up resources to be able to view that also as a part of our virtual family program. So, item number 1. You'll notice on this handout, and you guys are going to have something very similar to this, right? I've got written up here at the top, if you use the following, this will happen and you'll be powerless to prevent it. So I'm kind of taking a little bit of liberty there, with a word from the 12-step program, admitted we were powerless over addiction, admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and that our lives had become unmanageable. Well, what does that mean? If we use, our midbrain will process that drug in an addictive, disordered manner, and there is nothing we can do to change that, fix that, or correct that, or stop that if we use. And if we use, that's going to happen every single time. And as a result of how this midbrain now processes that drug, these symptoms are going to manifest themselves. And again, this has nothing to do with willpower, firm resolve, commitment, or determination, any more than a diabetic can eat a hot fudge sundae and just will their blood sugar to stay low. They may think they're going to do it. They may be convinced they can do it, but they eat that hot fudge sundae, their blood sugar is going to skyrocket. It has no bearing on what they think about that, right? And we know today the same holds true with addiction. So one of the things I'm going to be doing here is we're also going to do kind of a timeline of addiction. And on this side of the fence, this is somebody engaged in abuse, but they haven't yet crossed the line into, and this definitely needs to be done in black, they haven't crossed the line yet into addiction. So this is, yes, I'm an addict, no, I'm not. Yes, I'm an alcoholic, no, I'm not. Or I should say yet, right? So, and then we would see these as having early, middle, and late stages. We cross the line into addiction, and we now have early, middle, and late stages in active addiction. And this switch in the neurochemistry that I was talking about a little bit earlier, you can imagine that being right here at this crossover point. So over here on this side of the fence, that switch is off. For those that cross the line over to this side, that switch right here at this crossover point ignites and turns on. The off switch is broken. And this is where, again, cucumber over here, pickle is now going to be over here. And once that switch, again, is flipped, there is an addictive disordered neurochemistry in the midbrain. Again, it's alcoholism, not alcoholism. It will be there as a chronic condition going forward from that point. Just like the pancreas is a chronic condition going forward, and we need to engage in effective disease management, so it is with addiction. So how do we then diagnose this? How do we know, yes, I have crossed the line, no, I haven't? Well, we're going to see the answer to those questions in this particular form here. Now, this comes from the DSM-5, that's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual from the American Psychiatric Association. This is the most recent version that was put out in 2014. So there's 11 different items here. And again, as we go over these, it's basically, yeah, that describes me, or no, that doesn't. And so let's take a look at number one, and I'm going to kind of go over these just so they make a little more sense to you. Number one, the substance is often taken in either larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. Now, notice the wording here. It doesn't say the substance is rarely or occasionally taken. The substance is often taken, and there's two things we're evaluating here. Either in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. If either one of those is true, based on someone's experience to their relationship with alcohol or other drug use, you would circle that one. That one's going to be true. Item number two, and look how many different things we're actually evaluating here in this one item. There is a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control substance use. Any guess on how many you see there? If you said 4, you're right. There is a persistent desire to cut down or control, or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control. 4 separate items. If any one of those are true, all of them are true. The answer is circled as a yes. Now, just a side note here on never underestimate the power of denial. I had someone several years ago come into treatment. This was a gentleman who was drinking a fifth a day of vodka. Now, a fifth gets its name for being 1/5 of a gallon. That's a lot of vodka. That's over 25 ounces of vodka on a daily basis. And when I was going over this list with the gentleman, he looked at numbers 1 and numbers 2, and he said, I've never once tried to cut down or control my use. I don't drink over a longer period than was intended. I fully intend on drinking a fifth every single day. So numbers 1 and 2 don't apply to me. What you got next? And he was dead serious. Now, within a couple of weeks, he was kind of laughing at himself because he realized how much he was in denial, and he really did have a pretty significant problem. So that can be one of the limitations of this, is you're doing it on an interview basis, asking people questions, and the power of denial, which is fueled by rationalization, justification, minimization, things I like to call the ization nation, can make it really difficult for people to see things clearly, even though they may be quite evident to others. So number 3, a great deal of time is spent in activities to obtain the substance, use the substance, or recover from its effects. Now, the one that gets most people here that's kind of hard to get out of is use the substance. So this basically means how many hours a day, a week, a month are you under the influence of that drug? This isn't necessarily about how long it takes you to get it, or how much you're having to worry about recovering it. Because I have people all the time say, oh, get it while I'm in a grocery store, I grab it off the shelf, I put it in my cart. Okay, 15 seconds. Like, please, this isn't a problem for them. Or they'll say, I've never had a hangover. I don't, ever have to recover from the effects of it. I say, okay, so how many hours a day, a week, or month are you actively under the influence? And that's the one that gets pretty hard for people to deny. And I want to say something here too. I'm not saying if you use more than this, you definitely have a problem. But over the years of my asking a certain question, I've ended up getting a very common answer to that question. How many times a year many non-alcoholics, how many times a year do you think they are so intoxicated they should not get behind a wheel and drive? Any guess on that one? And I'm not saying they are getting behind the wheel or driving. I'm just saying your average non-alcoholic, how many times a year are they so intoxicated they should not get behind a wheel and drive? Meaning their BAC is 0.08. And you know, the answers may be shocking to some of you. It's 2 to 5 times a year. Now, I'm thinking that can be a light week. I mean, 2 to 5 times a year, but think about it. People don't have a relationship to and with intoxication. They're not out there where this is a significant part of their life. And maybe at Christmas, New Year's, anniversaries, weddings, special occasions, you know, they have a little bit too much to drink. And again, I'm not saying if, you know, you're doing it more than that, you definitely have a problem, but that's just kind of an indication of when people absolutely don't have any drinking problem whatsoever, they don't have a relationship to and with frequent intoxication. It's just not a part of their life. Now, me as a recovering alcoholic, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me because I was not one of those kind of people. And, you know, in my addiction, I ended up with daily use in ways that was just devastating for me in my life. The beautiful thing is, once we understand this and we're able to accept this, surrender to the truth of this, and we stop putting drugs in this neurochemistry, these symptoms will go away. This disease is 100% treatable. And you know what? We get better according to the best of our willingness. If you have the willingness to do what's necessary to get better, you're going to get better. And I really love that statistic. You don't often hear it. But this is absolutely a disease that has the ability to be fatal. And with many potentially fatal diseases, we may do everything possible to the best of our ability and still have a negative outcome. With this disease, that's not true. If we really do our part and we do everything necessary to put this disease into remission, it will go into remission and we will experience freedom from active addiction. And freedom from active addiction is the greatest gift anybody suffering from this disease can have, as well as their loved ones, right? So the next one on here, number 4. Cravings or a strong urge or desire to use the substance, all right? It's always amazed me over the year how many people will say no to this, they just do it, maybe because they like the taste. But, you know, they're not drinking lemonade or iced tea, right? So cravings, strong urge or desire to use the substance. Number 5, recurrent substance use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. So here we start seeing one of our first trifectas. It's really beginning to interfere with the quality of life in a variety of areas. Number 6, continued substance use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by the effects of the substance. That basically means it's causing problems for us in our relationships to and with others. All right? Number 7, here's another trifecta. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities are either given up or reduced because of substance use. Number 8, recurrent substance use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. One of the more common would be driving and using, driving under the influence, but there's other things that can qualify for this as well. Number 9 is a long one, but it's worth reading, and then on the last 2, I'll just kind of go over them verbally. So number 9, the substance use is continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that is likely to have been caused or made worse by the substance. As an example, continued drinking despite recognition that an ulcer was made worse by alcohol consumption, or perhaps continuing to use alcohol or other drugs and knowing that it really is making depression or anxiety worse, but yet somebody drinks because they say they're depressed or anxious, but they're actually engaging in behavior that's making those symptoms even worse, and so they use even more, making the symptoms even worse, and you can see where that goes, and it doesn't have a good outcome. Now, the last 2 on here, tolerance simply means using more to get the desired effect. Somebody drinking a glass of wine every night with dinner, now, Let me qualify that, providing it's not a big gulp, right? Somebody drinking a regular sized glass of wine every night with dinner and that's all they have, that's not an alcoholic. They're not showing evidence of tolerance. It's not getting out of control, and the other items on the list we went over would not be happening to them because of that one glass of wine per night with dinner, all right? With addiction and alcoholism, we are taking more and more to get the desired effect, and over time we see that really increase. Here's kind of another way of understanding it. A non-alcoholic at 0.25 BAC, non-alcoholic would not even be able to function well enough likely to get their car unlocked and get their car started, put it in gear and drive, right? An alcoholic is able to walk to their car, get it started up, and go on down the road seemingly okay, but they're really not, with a BAC of 3 times the legal limit. So it's just the significant difference between tolerance and addiction and non-tolerance. You'll have many alcoholics checking into the emergency rooms with BAC 0.40, even 0.50 and higher, and survive. Whereas a non-alcoholic at those BACs would be near comatose and at risk of a fatal alcohol overdose. So the last one on the list here, withdrawal. This is simply the experience of that, and more a function of daily users. This is a function of that restlessness, irritability, and anxiety because of not using, and the desire to really want to use to get rid of those feelings, right? But you also don't need to be a daily user in order to have a problem with addiction. There are many people that engage in what's called a binge pattern, where many of these 11 items are going to be true. Maybe number 11 isn't. Maybe they don't experience withdrawals because they're not using on a daily basis so that they have physiological dependence. So kind of one of the ways I heard it, and I think this is really a pretty good way to describe it also, it's not just how much you drink, it's what happens when you do. Or it's not just how much you use, again, it's what happens when you do. Okay, now that we've gone over the diagnostic criteria, let me show you how it plugs into the chart up here on the board. So, looking at addiction as a disease, right? Clearly, if somebody's 10 or 11 out of 11, they got a problem, right? But how much is viewed as necessary just to be right here, all right? So again, with addiction, we all follow kind of a similar pattern for those of us who cross the line into addiction. And it kind of goes along these lines. There was an age of first use, right? Often 12 or 13 years of age, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. And then that first use quickly turned into misuse. The misuse became abuse, and the abuse for some ends up becoming addiction. And here's kind of how it works. We progress from early to middle to late stages. Now, some people at this point stop. The consequences of their behavior enable them to realize this is not good, this is not working for me, I need to stop this, and they do, they stop it. And they then pull back to where they have a relationship to alcohol or other drug use that is reasonable, rational, responsible, they're in control of it, and they've kind of learned from their experience, and they have disengaged from any kind of abusive relationship to and with substance use. For those of us that go on to cross the line into addiction, that doesn't happen. We, for whatever reason, ignore those stop signs, yellow light, go faster, and this disease ends up developing. And that happens right here at this crossover point when somebody goes from late stage abuse and they're now over here in early stage addiction, right? And then it can continue to progress, and it will, by the way, with continued use, it will continue to progress, going from early to middle stage addiction, middle to late stage addiction. I even kind of like to say, going from late to double late and then to triple late. And there's a saying in a 12-step program saying the end for all addicts is jails, institutions, or death. Often said to the cadence of lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. It's frightening. But also another option that's not, conveyed in that statement is jails, institutions, or death, or recovery. And we know today that that recovery is abstinence-based. We know today that abstinence-based recovery is essential. Why? Because this broken drug processor in the midbrain of this neurochemistry cannot have a relationship to and with drug use without these symptoms happening. Those symptoms happening, once again, are on the list that we've reviewed in this session. So, how many are viewed as needed just to have crossed the line into early stage addiction? This may surprise some of you. By the time just 3 of the 11 are consistently starting to happen in someone's life, it's pretty hard to argue that they have not crossed that line into active addiction, right? That's no longer abuse. That's switch flipped in the neurochemistry. We now have a disease condition that's taking place, and it's going to be progressive, incurable, and fatal if left untreated, all right? By the time 5 out of the 11 are pretty consistently beginning to happen, you could say that we're in the middle stages of addiction. By the time we're hitting about 8 of the 11, we'd be in the later stages of active addiction, although the American Psychiatric Association actually considers this to be just 6 of 11. So when I say 8 out of 11, I'm being a little more generous than the American Psychiatric Association. You can even use their criteria actually to say even 6 out of 11 is really considered to be late stage substance use disorder. The way that it's rated is actually mild, moderate, severe. So just 6 of the 11 would be considered severe stage. And the consequences of this are just devastating. And as the addict continues to use, this continues to get worse and progressively get worse, again, until we're either in jails, institutions, or we've passed away as a result of this illness. Or we get into recovery, again, that's abstinence-based. And I just want to reiterate one thing here in closing up this session, that know that freedom from active addiction is the greatest gift that anybody can have that suffers from this condition. And it is 100% doable. It's 100% possible. You just need to do your part so that you can achieve it in your life. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.